There is a particular kind of cold that Glasgow does better than anywhere else on Earth. It is not just the temperature, it is the wet that comes with it. The kind that gets through your coat in the first 30 seconds, and then just lives there, against your skin, reminding you that the city has no particular interest in your comfort. I had spent 34 years learning to dress for that cold. I knew exactly which corner of Buchanan Street caught the worst of the wind off the Clyde. I knew that you needed a hat even in September, that you kept an umbrella in every bag, that the only way to survive a Glasgow November was to accept it and dress accordingly. I am telling you about the cold because I want you to understand what it felt like to be standing in it, on the pavement outside the house I had lived in since I was 24 years old, in a funeral dress that was soaked through to my underwear, watching a locksmith drill out the mechanism I had turned thousands of times. My husband's body was not yet cold. The wake had ended 90 minutes ago. I need you to hold both of those facts at the same time, because I had to. And it was the strangest, most disorienting sensation I have ever experienced. My mind kept trying to process them separately. The grief of losing Robert, 36 years of marriage, the man who had pressed a cup of tea into my hands every single morning without fail, and the completely surreal sight of a locksmith on my front step, drilling, while the November rain turned my black dress to a second skin. His name was on the van. Jimmy's Locksmith Service. Jimmy himself was maybe 25 years old, with a round, honest face and ears that went red in the cold. He would not look at me. He had tried once, when I'd first walked up the garden path, still clutching the order of service from the crematorium, Robert's face smiling up from the cardstock in my hands. Jimmy had caught my eye for exactly 1 second, and then looked back down at his drill with the focused intensity of a man trying very hard to believe he was somewhere else entirely. I understood why when Fiona appeared in the doorway. She had changed out of her funeral clothes. She was wearing dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, charcoal gray, and her hair was down. She looked comfortable. She looked, I remember thinking with a strange, detached clarity, like a woman who owned the house she was standing in. She crossed her arms. Her face was not angry. That would have been in some ways easier. Anger at least acknowledges that the situation has weight, that there is something here worth feeling. Fiona's face was simply hard, flat, a decision already made and filed away. "You don't live here anymore," she said. Those 5 words. I want you to understand how they landed, not as a shock exactly, but as a kind of confirmation of something I had half known was coming and spent months refusing to fully look at. The way you sometimes feel a fall beginning before your feet have left the ground. Behind her, I could see my son. David was 34 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered like his father had been. He was looking at the floor. Not at me, not at Fiona. At the floor, like a man counting tiles, like a man waiting for a difficult moment to be over. His hands were in his pockets. My son, whose school lunches I had made for 11 years, whose forehead I had felt for temperature 100 times with the back of my hand, who I had sat beside in the waiting room at the Royal Infirmary 8 weeks ago while we waited to hear whether his father's stroke was the kind you came back from. He was looking at the floor. I want to be precise about what that image did to me. Not the feeling of it, which is the part that everyone assumes is the point, but the specific quality of the memory it dislodged. David at 8 years old, having broken a neighbor's window with a football, standing in almost exactly that posture, shoulders slightly rounded, chin down, eyes directed at the floor, waiting for consequence while trying not to be present for it. I had crouched down and said his name, and he had looked up, and when he saw I was not angry, only disappointed, only concerned, something had unlocked in his face and he had told me what happened in a great tumble of words, relieved to be known. That boy would have looked up. That boy would not have been standing there at all. I thought about the years it takes to become the man looking at the floor from the boy who always eventually looked up. I thought about what accumulates in the space between those two versions of a person, habit and influence and the daily small decisions about what you will say and what you will not, what you will notice and what you will let pass. I thought about Fiona's steady, flat-eyed certainty, and about what it must cost, over years, to be the person standing next to that certainty, and whether the cost ever becomes visible to the person paying it. I hoped it did. I was not certain it would. Let me go back. Let me tell you who I was before that pavement, before that rain, before Jimmy the locksmith and his red ears and his careful avoidance of my eyes. Because the woman standing there in the soaked funeral dress, that is not who I started as. And understanding where I started is the only way to understand how far I fell and how far I had to climb back. I married Robert Dalglish when I was 22 years old, in a church in Shettleston in the early spring, and I wore a dress that my mother had spent 4 months saving for. Robert was 26, already working in logistics, already the kind of man who carried a notebook in his breast pocket and wrote things down. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who made an entrance at a party or dominated a room with his presence. He was the kind of man who noticed when your glass was empty and refilled it without being asked, who remembered that you'd mentioned a book you wanted to read and came home with it 3 weeks later, who got up before the alarm every single morning of our marriage to make the tea. We lived in a small flat in the East End for the first 3 years, saving. Robert saved like saving was a religious practice, with discipline and consistency and a quiet satisfaction in watching numbers grow. I thought I knew about his savings habits. I thought I understood the shape of our finances. I was wrong about that, but I did not know I was wrong for a very long time. David arrived in 1991, and we bought the house in Newlands, a 3-bedroom semi-detached with a garden that backed onto a lane. The kind of house that takes on the character of the people who live in it so thoroughly that when you finally leave, the rooms feel like a loss of self. I painted those walls 7 times over 34 years. 7 different colors as fashions and preferences changed, but the same walls, the same corners, the same awkward angle behind the radiator in the hallway where you always got paint on your knuckles no matter how careful you were. David grew up in those rooms. He became who he was in that house, or who I thought he was. Perhaps I always saw a version of him that was more what I hoped than what existed. Mothers do that. We build our children in our minds into the best version of what they might become, and we hold on to that image with a fierceness that borders on delusion, long after the evidence starts telling us something different. Fiona came into David's life 6 years ago. She was 28 when they met, ambitious, sharp, the kind of woman who assesses a room the moment she enters it, who has money, who has influence, where the opportunities are. I tried to like her. I tried genuinely, because David loved her, or said he did, and loving your child means loving what they love, or at least trying. I organized dinners. I learned that she did not eat red meat. I bought a different wine when she was coming because she'd mentioned once, casually, that she preferred Sauvignon Blanc. But there were moments, small ones, easily explained away. The way she would redirect the conversation when Robert and I were talking about something that didn't involve her. The way she would ask questions about the house, its value when we'd bought it, whether we'd had it surveyed recently, with an interest that felt off, just slightly, in a way I couldn't name. The way David changed in her presence, became quieter, deferential in a manner that seemed less like love and more like a habit he'd fallen into without noticing. 3 years before Robert's stroke, David sat us down in our own living room and explained that he'd been talking to a financial advisor, Fiona's cousin, as it happened, and that for estate planning purposes, for tax efficiency, it would make sense to transfer the house into his name. He had documents. He had explanations. He used the word inheritance and the phrase getting ahead of things. And he looked at me with such earnest reassurance that I felt almost embarrassed for being uncertain. Robert sat very still throughout the whole conversation. He asked 3 questions. I remember being surprised at how specific they were, how focused. Then he said he would think about it. 2 weeks later, he agreed, signed the papers. I thought that was the end of it. I thought we had done sensible estate planning and trusted our son, and that was the kind of thing responsible parents did. I had no idea that Robert, sitting across from David in Morrison's office, had made a condition that would change everything. Had no idea that he had looked at his son's face during that conversation, at whatever he had seen there, whatever a father sees that a mother sometimes misses, and quietly, without drama, without accusation, arranged a safety net I would not know about until I needed it most. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before the safety net, there was the fall. Robert's first stroke was in September. It was a mild one, which is a strange phrase for something that frightens you so thoroughly that your hands shake for 3 days afterward. He came home after 4 days in hospital, and I restructured our life around his recovery. The medication schedule became my second occupation. I kept a notebook, the way he had always kept notebooks, with times and doses and side effects to watch for and the phone numbers of 3 different consultants. I cooked the diet they recommended. I learned about blood pressure and anticoagulants and the particular kind of exhausted vigilance that comes from loving someone whose body has become unpredictable. He was doing well. That is what makes it so hard to explain. He was genuinely improving. The consultant had used the word encouraging at the last appointment, and Robert had made a small sound of satisfaction, the notebook open in his hands. He was doing well, and then in the early hours of a Tuesday morning he was not, and by Wednesday he was gone. And I was 58 years old and a widow, and none of the preparation I had done for every other difficulty in my life had prepared me for that. The funeral was on a Friday. 300 people. Robert had been well liked in a quiet, steady way, the kind of man whose absence leaves a particular silence because he was never loud to begin with. I stood at the front of the crematorium in my black dress, and I said the words that were required of me, and I accepted the hands pressed into mine, and I went through it the way you go through the worst days, which is to say, 1 minute at a time, and then 1 step at a time, and then 1 breath at a time, when even steps become too large a unit of measurement. The wake was at the house. I moved through it on autopilot, refilling plates, thanking people, accepting condolences, managing the logistics of grief the way I had managed the logistics of the last 2 months. Fiona was there, of course. She was an excellent hostess, I will give her that. She kept glasses full and conversation moving and smiled at exactly the right moments. David stayed close to her. I noticed, in a distant way, that they whispered to each other twice during the afternoon, and that afterward David's jaw had a set to it that I associated with decisions already made. I did not connect those whispers to what was coming. I should have. In retrospect, the signs were everywhere. But grief does something to perception. It narrows it, focuses it on the immediate and the sensory, makes pattern recognition temporarily impossible. I was watching the room and the people in it, and I was thinking about Robert, about the fact that he would never come down those stairs again, never make tea in that kitchen again. I was not watching for conspiracy. There was a woman I had known for 20 years, Margaret Cowan, no relation, which had always been a small joke between us, who came to me during the wake and held both my hands in hers and said nothing for a long moment, which was, of all the things anyone said to me that day, the most correct response. Language, at moments of real loss, has a way of arriving slightly wrong. The condolences that were too cheerful, the ones that were too philosophical, the ones that inadvertently made it about the speaker rather than the person they were addressing. Margaret Cowan's silence was perfect. I thought of her afterward, often. I also thought about the conversation I had with Robert's colleague from the logistics firm, a man named Stewart who had worked with him for 15 years, and who was, I could see, genuinely shaken in the way that people are shaken when someone they have assumed will simply always be there is suddenly and completely gone. He told me about a specific afternoon 3 years ago, when the company had been through a difficult audit period and morale was low, and how Robert had organized a lunch. Not a corporate thing, not approved by anyone, just a personal initiative. Booking a table at a place near the office and paying himself and telling people it was important to come, and how that afternoon had changed the tone of the following month. He just knew, Stewart said, when a room needed something. He pressed my hand and moved away, and I stood for a moment with that image, Robert, noticing a room, quietly arranging what it needed, and felt it settle alongside everything else I knew about him. Another tile in the mosaic, another piece of evidence of who he had been. Fiona was on the other side of the room during that conversation. I remember her watching from a slight distance, glass in hand. The last guests left at 3:30. I told Fiona I was going to walk to the corner shop for more milk. Something small, an errand, a reason to put my coat on and feel the air on my face for 5 minutes. I was gone perhaps 20 minutes. The corner shop was brisk and ordinary in the way that corner shops always are. The smell of newspapers and crisps and the particular plastic warmth of a space that is never fully cold. And the man behind the counter, Raj, who had served me semi-weekly for years, said he was sorry about Robert. He said it simply, without elaboration, and I said thank you, simply, without elaboration, and bought the milk and a bar of dark chocolate because it was there, and because I have never been able to clearly explain to myself why chocolate seems to make certain hours more manageable, but it does. I walked back in the rain that had been threatening since noon and had finally decided to commit. By the third minute, my coat was properly wet. I was thinking about what order to do things, whether to send the last few people home before I made tea, or make tea and let them linger, whether the evening would be better served by company or by the particular tender kind of solitude that the first night alone in a newly emptied house sometimes provides. I was thinking about none of the right things. When I came back up the garden path, my key did not work, and Jimmy from Jimmy's locksmith service was still drilling. You know what the strangest part was? Not the locksmith, not Fiona in the doorway, not even my son looking at the floor. The strangest part was the bin bag, a black refuse bag, the standard supermarket kind, sitting on the front step beside Jimmy's toolbox. And inside it, I could see the shape of it. The odd angles were things I recognized. The blue cardigan I wore around the house, the toiletry bag from the bathroom, some photographs, loose, not in frames. Fiona had packed me a bag. She had been upstairs, in my house, going through my things, deciding what I was allowed to take, while I was walking to the corner shop for milk. She held a second bag out to me when I reached the doorstep. Her eyes met mine without flinching. I want you to understand that. The steadiness of it, the absolute absence of uncertainty. This was not a woman in the grip of an impulsive decision. This was a woman who had planned, who had researched, who had waited for the right moment with the patience of someone who understood that timing is everything. The house was in David's name, she said. Her voice was flat and even, the voice of someone reading from a document they have memorized. You signed it over 3 years ago. You've got no claim to anything here. She paused. Jimmy's drill had stopped. The rain was very loud in the silence. You're just the woman who used to live in our house. I have replayed those words so many times, in so many different states of mind, that they have taken on an almost abstract quality. You're just the woman who used to live in our house. 10 words. Said in the voice of someone naming a fact. Not cruelty for its own sake, not drama, not even the satisfaction of cruelty. Just a verdict, a reclassification. You were one thing. Now you are this. Sign here. My hands were still trembling. I had helped carry Robert's coffin that morning, my hands on the polished wood, and they had not stopped shaking since. I looked at Fiona. I looked at the bin bag. I looked at David, who was still looking at the floor, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that he was not going to speak, that he had already said everything he intended to say in those 2 whispered conversations during the wake. That the man looking at the floor was not, in this moment, my son in any way that mattered. I took the bin bag. A car went past, unhurried, wipers going. The driver did not look at us, at the locksmith, at me, at Fiona in the doorway. The ordinary indifference of a street in the late afternoon, a wet Friday in November in Glasgow, no reason to slow down and assess. Next door I could see a light on in the upper floor. Mrs. Patterson, 82, who I had looked in on twice a week since her husband died, who I had sat with through 3 different health scares, who I had taken shopping on Thursdays when she could not manage the bus. Her curtains were drawn, but a thin line of light escaped at the edge. I had a passing, very clear thought about whether anyone would remember to check on her, and then I understood, from the fact that I was still standing on this pavement holding a bin bag, that the answer was probably not me. David had still not moved. He was still looking at the floor. I looked at him one more time, deliberately, a long look, the kind that asks something even if the person receiving it does not know what is being asked. He did not look up. I picked up the bin bag. I shouldered my handbag. I turned and walked toward the gate. I do not remember walking away. I remember being on the pavement, and then I remember the rain, and then I remember the weight of the bag and the order of service still in my other hand. Robert's face looking up at me from the card. I had 120 Sathatter in my personal account, a mobile phone, a soaked funeral dress, a handbag, a bin bag of clothes and toiletries and loose photographs. And there was a business card in my purse, a small cream-colored card with raised lettering. Patrick Morrison, solicitor. Merchant City. Robert had pressed it into my hand 2 weeks before the stroke. I had been so focused on his medication schedule, on the 4 types of pill that had to be taken at specific intervals, that I had put it in my purse without asking why and then forgotten it was there. I did not know, standing on that rainy pavement, that the card was a key. I did not know what it unlocked. That knowledge was coming, but first I had to survive long enough to use it. Let me tell you what invisibility actually feels like. Not the metaphorical kind, not the philosophical kind, the real practical kind that descends when the structures around you collapse. It happens faster than you'd think. 24 hours, maybe less. I booked the Travelodge off the M8 because it was the cheapest thing I could find on my phone that had a room available that night. The young man at the desk was maybe 22, tired, working the night shift. When I asked about weekly rates because 127 was not going to last at standard nightly prices, and I had no idea yet what I was going to do, he looked at me, and there was nothing in his eyes. Not unkindness, not cruelty, just absence. I was a woman in a wet coat asking about weekly rates, and I was not, in any meaningful sense, present to him. He told me the rates in the same tone he would use for the printer that needed paper. I thanked him and took my key. The room was small and smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and the faint ghost of other people's overnight stays. I sat on the bed in my wet funeral dress and I did not cry. I noticed that. The absence of crying. I had cried at the crematorium, quiet tears I had tried to manage, and then the grief had seemed to go somewhere else, somewhere deeper and less accessible, replaced by a kind of operational mode that my body had apparently decided was necessary for survival. I laid out the contents of the bin bag on the bed. Fiona had packed with efficiency. I will grant her that. 7 items of clothing, selected with no apparent principle beyond what happened to be in the wardrobe rather than the wash. My toiletry bag. A small handful of photographs, not the framed ones. Those had stayed, but some loose ones from a drawer somewhere. Robert and me at a cousin's wedding in 1997. David at maybe 7 or 8, missing a front tooth, grinning in the garden. A photograph of my mother. The china my mother had given me was still in the house in Newlands. The christening gown I had sewn myself, the one I had kept wrapped in acid-free tissue paper in the top of the wardrobe, was still there. Robert's books, 40 years of collected paperbacks, thrillers, and history, and the Ian Rankin novels he reread every few years, were still there. All of it, still there. In a house I was not allowed to enter. I fell asleep in my funeral dress because I could not make myself care enough to change. The morning was gray, but you know that, because Glasgow mornings are always gray in November, and this is not actually the point. The point is that the first morning in the Travelodge room arrived not with any of the soft mercies that grief is sometimes supposed to provide. The first few seconds before consciousness fully returns, the moments before memory catches up, but with an immediate, complete awareness of exactly where I was and why. Consciousness arrived at full load, the way it sometimes does when the thing you are carrying is too large for the mind to put down, even for a moment. I sat up. I was still in my funeral dress, which had dried overnight in that particular stiff, creased way that fabric has when it dries wrong, and my hair was flat on one side and there was mascara, the modest amount I had worn for the service, on the pillowcase. The room looked exactly the same as it had at 11 o'clock the previous night, which is to say small, clean, anonymous, completely indifferent to the fact that I existed in it. I showered. I put on the same clothes because I had not yet worked out a rotation. I made tea from the small kettle on the desk, those terrible little sachets, the tea equivalent of a photograph of something that used to be food, and I drank it standing at the window, looking at the car park and the gray sky above the retail park, and I made a list. Not an emotional list, a practical list. What I had, what I needed, what I could do with what I had to get what I needed. The kind of list Robert would have made. I wrote it in the back of the small notebook I happened to have in my handbag, a notebook I had been using for his medication schedule, the columns of times and doses that had been the shape of my days for 8 weeks, now suddenly obsolete. I turned past those pages without looking at them and wrote in the blank space at the back. Assets, 127 in current account. 1 mobile phone with a charger, 7 items of clothing, toiletry bag, the business card in my purse, the one I had not yet allowed myself to look at directly, the one that might be something and might be nothing. Needs, somewhere cheaper to sleep by tomorrow, food, a plan. The list was very short. I looked at it for a while. Then I put the notebook in my bag and went to find a DIL. The housing office was on a Tuesday. I sat in a plastic chair for 2 hours before my name was called, and then I sat across from a woman who had the particular expression of someone who processes difficult human situations so frequently that the difficulty has been worn smooth, like a stone in a river. She explained the waiting list: 18 months for pensioner accommodation, which is what they called it, pensioner accommodation, which made me feel a sudden, fierce objection, even though the mathematics of my situation argued otherwise. I mentioned my work history: 23 years as a school secretary, paid national insurance contributions for 35 years, never once asked for help. She typed something. Her expression did not change. Everyone's got a story, Hen. You'll need to fill out these forms. Hen. A Glasgow endearment that in her mouth was simply a category, a filing system. A woman of a certain age in certain circumstances. Forms to be filled. I filled the forms. The forms were 6 pages long and asked questions about my financial situation, my housing history, my health, my dependents, and several other aspects of my circumstances that I had never previously been required to reduce to writing. I answered them accurately and completely, in my clearest handwriting, sitting at the plastic table in the waiting area after my name had been called and processed and filed. A woman across the table from me was doing the same thing, moving through the pages with the same focused deliberateness. 2 women in a waiting area writing down the quantified summary of their difficulties. We did not speak. We exchanged one look, brief, acknowledging, the kind that doesn't need words because there are no words that would add anything, and then we both returned to our forms. I finished before her and sat waiting for my documents to be accepted, watching the room, watching the careful performance of everyone in it of being fine, being sorted, being someone for whom this was simply an administrative procedure rather than one of the worst weeks of their life. I was very good at that performance. I had been practicing for 11 days. The church was worse, and I say that knowing how bleak the housing office was. I had volunteered in the charity shop for 9 years. 9 years of Wednesday mornings, sorting donations and pricing items and managing the till and organizing the window displays. I knew every corner of that shop, knew which donations tended to come in after which seasons, knew that the good vintage clothing sold fastest if you put it at eye level. I showed up that Wednesday because I did not know what else to do with myself, because the routine was the only familiar thing I had left, because the shop felt, in some irrational way, like mine. Fiona was already there. She was rearranging the window display, moving a coat stand I had placed there 3 weeks earlier, shifting things with the proprietary ease of someone who has staked a claim. She turned when I came in, and her expression was the same one she'd worn on the doorstep. Flat, settled, decided. We've got enough volunteers just now, Margaret. Maybe it's time you focused on getting yourself sorted. I looked around the shop. 3 other women were there. Women I had known for years. Women who had stood in my kitchen and drunk my tea and told me things about their lives that they would not tell just anyone. Claire was there, her back to me, straightening a rack of dresses with excessive attention, her shoulders tense in a way that told me she knew exactly what was happening and had made her choice about it. Another woman looked at a spot 6 inches above my head. The third rearranged folded jumpers with unnecessary focus. I said nothing. I walked out. And I felt something shift, some remaining structure of the life I had known giving way with a sound that was not quite audible, but was completely felt. By the end of the first week, I had become the kind of woman that Margaret before would have noticed on the street with a particular mixture of sympathy and private relief. I counted coins in Tesco to decide between the meal deals. I rationed my phone battery like it was a finite resource. I smiled carefully at everyone because I had learned very quickly that people respond to distress in one of 2 ways. They either help, or they look away, and you cannot know in advance which it will be, and looking away is more common and is less painful if you have not already opened yourself to expecting help. The social worker I was assigned, a young woman named Karen, efficient, kind in a practiced way, spoke to me in the careful, measured voice reserved for people in crisis. Slow, clear, checking for comprehension. I understood now in a category. The category was, Woman of a certain age in unexpected housing difficulty, possible cognitive concerns due to stress, to be handled gently and directed toward the appropriate forms. I had, 3 weeks earlier, been a person. Now I was a case. Here is what I did not do. I did not break. I want to be clear about this. Not because I want you to think I was brave, I was not particularly, but because I want you to understand what the second week of that Travelodge room revealed about me. I stretched 127 across 11 days by eating at the Lidl on the retail park and limiting myself to 1 meal deal and 1 hot drink per day, and nothing else. I walked to every appointment, rather than paying bus fares. I washed my 7 items of clothing in the bathroom sink and dried them on the radiator overnight. I did not know I could do any of those things until I was doing them. I am not saying it was fine. It was not fine. There were nights when the operational mode switched off unexpectedly, and the grief came back at full volume. Not just the grief for Robert, but the grief for the life I had thought I had, for the son I thought I had raised, for the version of myself that had believed the world was fundamentally organized toward decency. Those nights were very long, but they ended. And in the mornings I was still there, still upright, still capable of filling forms and stretching money and navigating the particular bureaucratic language of crisis support systems. I was surviving, and survival, I was beginning to understand, is not nothing. On the 11th day, I found the business card in my purse. I almost did not call. That sounds strange, but there is a particular kind of hope. Fragile, carefully protected, that you become reluctant to test when you have been disappointed enough times. What if Morrison told me there was nothing? What if Robert had forgotten, or the card was just a general professional connection, or whatever he had meant to do, he had not had time to do? What if I called and there was no safety net after all? The not knowing, terrible as it was, at least preserved the possibility of something. Calling would make it real either way. I called from a bench in George Square because I could not make myself do it in the Travelodge room. When I gave my name, there was a pause on the other end. The kind of pause that means the name has landed somewhere specific, that it has been expected. The secretary said Mr. Morrison had asked that I call. Could I come in that afternoon? The office was on Candleriggs in the Merchant City, that stretch of Glasgow that has been restored back into its Victorian elegance, the old merchant warehouses with their sandstone facades and their brass plaques gleaming with polished self-importance. I stood outside for 3 full minutes. I was wearing the same blouse I had worn for 3 days because my rotation was limited. My coat had a stain on the left sleeve that I had tried to address with a wet flannel and succeeded only in making more prominent. My hair was clean. I had managed that. But there was a tiredness in my face that no amount of good intentions could conceal. I almost turned around and walked back to the bus stop. I counted the people passing on the pavement instead, a habit I had developed at some point in the previous 11 days, the bus stop, the housing office, the Tesco, as a way of anchoring myself to the fact of the external world when the internal world became too loud. 5 people in the time I stood there. A woman with a buggy, moving fast. 2 young men in matching jackets, mid-conversation, unconcerned. An older man with a good overcoat who moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been in this part of the city long enough to own it by familiarity. A girl who looked perhaps 14, school bag on her back, headphones in, existing in her own separate atmosphere. None of them looked at me. I was, as I had learned, invisible in the particular way of women of a certain age in a certain kind of difficulty, not threatening enough to avoid, not interesting enough to notice, simply part of the background of the city, like the stone buildings themselves. Present, unacknowledged, older than anyone currently bothered about. I went in. But Morrison himself came to the waiting room. He was perhaps 65, silver-haired, wearing a suit that had been good for a long time rather than recently expensive. He had the kind of face that had started kind and then spent decades becoming more so. He shook my hand with both of his. "Mrs. Dalglish," he said, and his voice had something in it that I had not heard in 11 days, which was the recognition that I was a person rather than a case. "I am very sorry about Robert. He was a genuinely good man." He led me to his office and closed the door and offered tea, which I accepted because I was cold all the way through, and because tea is sometimes the only thing that makes a difficult conversation manageable. He sat across from me, and between us was a file that was, I noticed, surprisingly thick. Robert came to see me a month ago, he said. He was concerned about certain things he had observed. He wanted to be certain you would be protected. He opened the file. He spoke carefully, clearly, with the precision of a man who has delivered complicated news many times and has learned to do it in a way that gives the recipient time to absorb. He watched my face as he talked, pausing when he needed to, circling back when something needed clarification. What he told me took 20 minutes, and I had to ask him to repeat parts of it twice. 3 years ago, when David had come to Robert with the house transfer proposal, Robert had agreed, but not in the way David imagined. Robert had asked one question: what is the market value? David had said approximately €285. Robert had said, then buy it. Not receive it as a gift. Buy it. Sign the paperwork, transfer the money, make the transaction clean and legal and complete. David had signed. The $285,000 had gone into an account held in Robert's name alone, not the joint account that David managed, not any account David had access to. Robert had been meticulous about the separation. And then Morrison told me about the other account. Robert had been saving since the first year of our marriage. Small amounts, $20 here, $50 there, whatever could be quietly set aside from his salary without disrupting the household finances in any noticeable way. He had done this for 40 years, and he had invested it with the same steady discipline he brought to everything, and he had let it accumulate without ever mentioning it. Not because he was hiding it from me in any harmful sense, but because he was, Robert, completely, entirely Robert, quietly arranging something in case it was ever needed. The way he had always kept an extra 10 pounds in the emergency envelope in his bedside drawer and never spent it except for real emergencies. The total in the account Morrison now showed me, turning the folder toward me across the desk, was $247,340. I am going to let that number sit there for a moment, because it sat there for quite a long time in my own mind, refusing to integrate. £247,340. 40 years of disciplined, silent love, accumulated into a number that meant I would never stand in a housing office again. Never count coins for a meal deal. Never lie in a Travelodge room counting the hours until it was acceptable to try to sleep again. Why didn't he tell me? My voice cracked on the last word. I had not cried in 11 days. The operational mode had held, but something about those numbers, about the image of Robert quietly, faithfully setting aside whatever he could for 40 years against a rainy day that he had hoped would never come, something about that broke the seal. Morrison's expression was carefully composed, but there was something in it. A complexity, a kindness complicated by the weight of what he was carrying. He had sat with this information, I realized, since Robert had come to him a month ago. Knowing what was likely coming, unable to tell anyone, waiting. He left a letter, Morrison said. He said he wanted you to have a soft landing. He said he didn't want to worry you while he was still here to take care of things. A pause. He didn't expect the stroke. He thought he had time. He thought he had time. I sat with that sentence for a long moment in the silence of Morrison's office. Outside, Glasgow was doing what it does. Traffic, rain, the particular muffled thrum of a city that never entirely quiets. But in that room there was only the ticking of a wall clock that I had not noticed before, and the weight of a sentence that contained an entire rearrangement of my understanding of the last month. Robert had gone to this office. He had made an appointment. He had brought his notebook. I was certain of the notebook. Certain in the way you are certain of fundamental truths about a person you have known for 36 years. He had sat in the chair I was now sitting in, and he had told Morrison what he was afraid of, and what he needed and what he wanted to make sure of. And he had done all of this without telling me, because telling me would have meant admitting what he had seen in his son's face in that conversation about the house transfer, and admitting it would have broken something he was not ready to break. He had protected me from knowing what he suspected. He had also protected me from the consequences of that suspicion being correct. I looked at the window. Rain against the glass, because of course there was rain, because this was Glasgow and rain is what Glasgow offers at moments of consequence. I thought about Robert in this office, a month ago, sitting across from Morrison with his notebook, surely his notebook, and his careful questions, arranging things, being Robert. being, until his very last capable days, the man who refilled your glass before you noticed it was empty. He had also bought a flat. Morrison said it almost gently, as though he understood that he was at the limit of what I could absorb and was managing the dosage accordingly. 7 years ago, Robert had purchased a small flat in Dennistune as an investment property, tenanted throughout. Mortgage fully paid off 2 years ago. Currently leased to a young couple, but the lease was ending in 6 weeks. And the flat was held in a trust, all documents in order, and I was the sole beneficiary. Morrison slid the deeds across the desk. I put my hand on the paper and held it there. The paper was slightly cool under my fingers. Smooth, ordinary paper describing an extraordinary thing. A future. Not the future I had planned. Not the future I had imagined, but a future. A roof. A door with a key that was mine, that no locksmith would ever be called to change. You ever have a moment where you understand something about yourself that you did not know before? Not something small, something structural, something that rearranges the load-bearing walls of how you have understood your own identity. I had spent 58 years believing in some quiet but foundational way that I was the woman who needed looking after. Not helpless. I was not helpless. I had never been helpless, but positioned in the family and in my own self-conception as the one who needed the framework that others provided. Robert provided it. David was supposed to carry it forward. I had signed papers when I was asked to sign them, trusted people I was told to trust, operated within a structure that others designed and that I, grateful and reliable and useful within its walls, had never questioned. And then the walls had come down. And I had survived 11 days with 127s and a bin bag, and I had found accommodation and navigated systems I had never needed to navigate, and stretched resources further than they had any right to stretch. And I had done all of it without falling apart, without asking anyone for help, without becoming the woman curled in the corner of a Travelodge room who could not function. The woman who had signed away her house because her son asked her to trust him would not have managed that. That woman would have collapsed under the weight of it. The woman sitting in Morrison's office, hand on the deeds to her own property, had already proven that she was somebody else. I looked at the documents Morrison had laid out before me, the savings account, the property deeds, the trust documentation, Robert's letter which I would read later in private, with the time and space such a letter deserved. I looked at the organized thoroughness of it, the evidence of how completely and meticulously my husband had loved me without my ever knowing the full extent of it. I need a moment, I told Morrison. Take all the time you need, he said, and he meant it. I took 4 minutes. Then I asked him what we needed to do next. The Dennistown flat was on Armadale Street, a tenement building with a stone close and a communal stair and high ceilings that let in whatever gray light Glasgow could manage. The tenants, a young couple, both in their late 20s, had not been rough with it exactly. But they had been indifferent in the way that people who do not own their home are sometimes indifferent to it. The kitchen needed repainting. The bathroom grouting needed replacing. The hall carpet had a water stain near the front door. The living room walls were a shade of cream that had yellowed with age and 2 people's cooking, and a cat that had apparently lived there for at least a year, judging by the scratches on the skirting. I stood in the empty flat. The tenants had moved out on schedule. Decent people who shook my hand and wished me well. And I turned around slowly in the center of the living room and I thought about what I wanted. Not what was practical, what I wanted. I had not asked that question about a physical space in 34 years. The house in Newlands had been painted and repainted according to what was sensible, what was neutral enough for everyone, what would not date. I had accommodated and compromised and considered other people's preferences with such habitual thoroughness that the habit had become invisible. The way a back problem becomes invisible once it has been there long enough. You stop noticing you are compensating. I wanted pale gray walls. The specific gray of morning light on stone. I wanted white trim. I wanted the kitchen cabinets in a dark green that I had seen in a magazine at the dentist's office 2 years ago and quietly liked and said nothing about. I hired a contractor for the work that required professional hands. The bathroom, the kitchen cabinet replacement, a piece of damaged plasterwork in the bedroom ceiling. His name was Tommy, mid-40s, work boots permanently decorated with paint in at least 6 colors. A man who operated on the basis that if a job was worth doing, it was worth doing properly. and that cutting corners was a form of disrespect to the building. He came to see the flat, stood in the center of the living room exactly as I had done, looked at the walls and the ceiling and the light from the windows. "What are you thinking for the color scheme?" he asked. I told him. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is actually considering what you have said rather than simply waiting for you to finish. "The pale gray will work well with those north-facing windows. You'll need the right undertone, something warm, or it'll feel cold in winter. I can bring swatches." He brought swatches. We stood in the living room for 20 minutes discussing undertones, and I gave my opinion, and he listened to my opinion, and we reached a decision together. And when I said something he disagreed with, he said so directly, and explained why, and then asked what I thought. And I realized with a start, having a professional conversation in which I was the decision maker, and he was the skilled advisor, and the entire exchange was proceeding as though my preferences were the natural center of things. I had forgotten that was possible. I painted the walls myself. Not because I needed to save the money. I had, for the first time in 11 days, enough money that painting walls was a choice rather than a necessity, but because I needed to do something with my hands that was transformative and visible, something where I could stand at the end of the day and see what I had made. I had painted walls before 7 times in the house in Newlands, but I had done it with the slightly compressed energy of someone performing a task rather than expressing a preference. This was different. The color on the palette was called Pebble Shore. It went on in long, even strokes, and as it dried, it did exactly what I had hoped, caught the gray Glasgow light and made something gentle and solid from it, something that felt like it belonged here, in this city, in this building, in these specific walls. I cut in around the windows on my 3rd attempt, which was not as clean as I would have liked, but was clean enough, and when I stepped back and looked at it, I felt something I had not felt in, I had to think, a very long time. I felt like I was home. The first night I slept there, before the bookshelves, before most of the furniture, with a borrowed sleeping bag and a borrowed lamp from Tommy and my 7 items of clothing in a pile against one wall, I lay in the center of the floor of what would be my bedroom and listened to the building. Tenement buildings have their own vocabulary. The creak of the common stair when a neighbor comes home late, the sound of water moving in old pipes, the particular acoustic way that footsteps on stone travel through walls. This building spoke in a lower register than the house in Newlands, older and denser, the sandstone doing something with sound that the suburban semi-detached never had. I thought about Robert, which I knew would happen and had been allowing myself to do deliberately since Morrison's office, not the suppressed, controlled grief of the funeral and its aftermath, but the fuller, more complete version. I thought about what he would have made of this flat, whether he would have seen what I saw in it. I thought he would. He had always had an eye for value, not monetary value, but the kind of value that lives in bones and proportions and good light. He would have liked the ceilings. He would have checked the window frames for rot. He would have approved. I wanted very much to tell him about it, that wanting was sharp and clean, and I let it be there without trying to resolve it. The furniture was assembled one piece at a time, a combination of charity shop finds and the IKEA in Braehead. The bookshelf was the most difficult. I got the back panel on backwards on the first attempt and had to take the whole thing apart and start again. And then on the second attempt, I dropped a shelf and had to coax the dowels back into their holes. And on the third attempt, it went together correctly, firmly, satisfyingly solid. I stood it upright and tested its stability by pressing on the top corner with both hands, and it held without wobbling. And I said something to the empty room, a small private sound of triumph that I would be embarrassed to reproduce here. The woman at the hardware shop on Duke Street learned my name in the second week. Her name was Helen, late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and an opinion about every product in the shop, all of which turned out to be correct. She started setting aside the good brushes when they came in, the ones with the split bristles for cutting in cleanly. "I know you're almost done," she said on the third visit, "but you'll want them for next time." Next time. As though it were assumed that I would have a next time, that there would always be another room, another project, another decision to make about how I wanted my life to look. As though I were a person with continuity, with a future in which projects accumulated. I joined the library book group in November. Not the church group, which I had no intention of returning to, but the one that met on Thursday evenings in the Dennistoun branch, a small room with mismatched chairs and a table that was slightly too big for the space. 8 women and 1 man, ranging from 30 to 75, all of them reading the same book and prepared to disagree about it, which is the only kind of book group worth joining. They did not know about Fiona or David or any of it. They knew that I had opinions about Ian Rankin's later novels, and that I brought excellent shortbread, a recipe of my mother's, butter and rice flour and exactly the right amount of sugar, and that I was capable of holding a position in an argument without backing down when pressured. "You should have been a barrister," said the man in the group, Gordon. After I had spent 15 minutes explaining why the ending of a particular crime novel was structurally dishonest, he said it as a compliment. I started at the women's charity in January. Aisha ran it. Aisha Mahmood, 31 years old, one of those people who makes the room more efficient simply by being in it, who has the rare and valuable quality of knowing exactly what needs doing and finding the right person for it without drama or politics. She had put out a call for admin volunteers, and I had answered it expecting to spend Tuesday afternoons alphabetizing files, which I was prepared to do, because useful work is useful work whatever form it takes. Within 3 weeks, Aisha had me redesigning the donation tracking system. Within 2 months, I was training other volunteers in its use. Within 3 months, I was writing grant applications, careful, specific, evidence-based documents that made the case for funding in language that committees could act on. I had never written a grant application in my life. I turned out to have a talent for it that surprised me and did not, in retrospect, surprise Aisha at all. "You've got an administrative brain," she told me, in the matter-of-fact way that she said everything, as though this were obvious information that I had simply not yet encountered. "The kind that sees systems and knows how to make them better. We've needed someone like you." The phrase sat with me. Someone like you. Said simply, without performance, as a statement of genuine organizational need. I was, it turned out, someone who was needed. Not in the ambient, structural way that mothers are always needed, always available, always there, but specifically professionally because of actual skills I possessed. Aisha was not kind to me. She was precise with me, which is better. The first grant application I wrote was for a funding stream through the Council's Community Wellbeing Initiative, £12,000 requested to extend the charity's emergency housing support program for women exiting difficult domestic situations. I wrote it in the back office on a Tuesday afternoon in 2 hours, using the template structure Aisha had shown me and my own instinct for what the evidence needed to say and how. I had no particular confidence in it. I submitted it by the deadline and thought nothing more. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. Funded in full. Aisha showed the letter to me without ceremony, set it on the desk in front of me while I was reorganizing the volunteer schedule, and said simply, "That's yours." I read it. I read it again. "We've applied for that stream 4 times, Aisha said from the other side of the room, not looking up from what she was doing. Never got past the first round. I sat with the letter in my hands. I had done something that had not been done before, not by luck, not by existing in the right place, but by being precisely the right person for a specific task and applying myself to it fully. That was, I realized, a feeling I wanted more of. By March, I had a life. I want to say that plainly because it still surprised me every morning to feel it. I had a life. Not a shadow of one, not the rubble of a previous one, but a life with texture and movement and people in it who knew me as I was now, rather than as I had been. Tommy had taken me to his daughter's school play, a musical production that was enthusiastically performed and technically imperfect and entirely delightful, because his daughter had made an extra ticket, and he had thought of me. The book group met Thursdays at my flat now because I had the most comfortable chairs, and Helen from the hardware shop had given me a tip on a floor lamp that made the living room properly readable in the evenings. Aisha had asked me to join the charity's board of directors. A board. Me, who had spent 3 decades being the secretary, was going to be a director. I had, without entirely noticing it happening, become visible again. Meanwhile, and I say meanwhile in the way that you say it about a storm gathering in the distance that you can see from your window, but that has not yet reached you, things in Newlands were deteriorating. I heard it from Claire. In January, Claire had texted me out of nowhere, just a message, carefully neutral in tone, asking how I was getting on. I had answered honestly, if briefly. She had answered back. And so began an irregular correspondence that was neither friendship exactly nor what it had been, but something in between. A woman managing guilt by parceling out information, which at least had the virtue of being information. The house needed a new roof. The estimate was £12,000. David had paid for the kitchen renovation Fiona had wanted, £35,000, by taking out a loan, and the repayments were significant against his salary as a regional manager. There was a second loan now, to service the first. Fiona had been telling people in their social circle, and at the church, Claire said, with a slight awkwardness in the phrasing that suggested she knew she was reporting something she perhaps should not, that David's inheritance from his parents was coming, that there was money set aside, that they would be sorted when the time came. There was no inheritance coming. Robert had left everything to me, properly and legally documented, and I was 58 years old and in good health and had taken up swimming 3 mornings a week at the public pool on Duke Street, and had absolutely no intention of dying anytime soon. The gap between what Fiona had told people and what was actually true was a chasm, and chasms have a way of eventually becoming visible. Claire also mentioned, this was later, in February, that some of the women at the church had started asking questions about the story Fiona had been telling. The official version was that I had moved out by choice. Fresh start. Margaret wanted her independence. It was, Claire said, the version Fiona had provided at the prayer group and in conversations after the Sunday service, delivered with the slight head tilt of someone conveying sensitive information kindly. But then someone had seen me at the Travelodge, and someone else had noticed that my number had apparently stopped working for a while, which did not match the story of a woman who had chosen to relocate for her own reasons. Stories have internal logic, and when the logic goes wrong, people who hear enough of them start to notice. People are asking questions, Claire said. She didn't say what questions. She didn't have to. I did not go looking for a confrontation with David. That is important to me, not because I think confrontation is always wrong, but because the confrontation that actually happened was the right one, at the right time, in the right circumstances, and it happened because I was living my life rather than engineering a moment. The moment found me. It was a Saturday in March, 9 months after the funeral. I was in the Tesco on Duke Street, the big one, with the car park and the bakery section that smells aggressively of fresh bread for about 30 feet around the doors. I had a basket with fresh vegetables, leeks and carrots and a piece of salmon, and a bottle of decent Rioja because Aisha was coming for dinner on Sunday, and I had been trying a new way with roasted vegetables that I wanted to test. I was examining the wine labels with the particular focus of someone who knows roughly what they want and is cross-referencing label information to confirm it, when I heard someone say my name. I turned around. David was standing 8 feet away, a handbasket in his grip. The handbasket contained meal deal sandwiches, 3 of them, and a 4-pack of economy lager. He was wearing clothes that were slightly too casual for how he used to dress, the kind of slight downgrade in standards that happens when money is tight and maintenance becomes a low priority. He looked tired. Not the tired of a hard week, the tired of a long, sustained pressure that had been going on for some time and was not lifting. He had startled when he saw me. That was the word. Startled, a physical jolt, as though my existence had genuinely not occurred to him as a possibility in this context. As though I had ceased in his mind, to be a person who moved through the world and occupied space in supermarkets. I looked at him. I did not say anything immediately. I let the moment be what it was. 2 people who had once known each other very well, standing in a supermarket aisle with their respective baskets, and the distance between what those baskets contained being a kind of autobiography in itself. I was wearing my good wool coat. I had bought it in October with money from Robert's account, and it was the kind of coat I had been admiring for years. Properly warm, properly cut, charcoal gray with a slight structure to it that made you stand differently when you wore it. Not expensive in an ostentatious way, but good. The kind of quality that announces, quietly and without insistence, that the person wearing it has made a considered choice. I looked healthy. I knew I did because Tommy had said so 2 weeks ago, in his direct and unself-conscious way. You look well, Margaret. Better than when you started the flat. The swimming had done something for my posture, I thought. I stood differently than I had a year ago, straighter, with a solidity that came from 8 months of rebuilding rather than accommodating. David's basket contained meal deals and economy lager. My basket contained fresh vegetables, salmon, and good wine. We looked at each other across 8 feet of supermarket aisle. I thought about whether to say his name first or wait. I had rehearsed this meeting, not consciously, not deliberately, but the way the mind rehearses things that it knows are eventually inevitable, running scenarios in quiet moments, on the bus, in the swimming pool's rhythmic silence. In the rehearsals, he was always more present, more remorseful, more willing to be the son I had believed him to be. In the rehearsals, I sometimes said more too. The full inventory of that night, the specific weight of each thing taken, the bill of particulars that I had never presented to anyone because grief and survival had not left space for it. But here we were, 8 feet apart in the wine aisle, and the rehearsals fell away and left only the reality of him, which was less than I had allowed myself to hope, and more complicated than I had prepared for. He looked like David. He looked exactly like David, my David, the boy in the photograph with the missing tooth. Age does that, makes a person continuous with all the versions of themselves simultaneously. And sometimes that continuity is the hardest part. You cannot look at a man your child has become without also seeing the child he was, and you cannot see the child without feeling the full weight of the distance between who he was then and who he chose to be. I waited. "Mum," he said, and his voice broke on the word. Not dramatically, just a small human crack. The sound of something under pressure giving way slightly at a seam. I said nothing. "I didn't know you were... Where are you living?" "I'm sorted," I said. "Your father made sure of that." I watched him process it. I watched the moment the meaning landed, not just that I had somewhere to live, but the full weight of the sentence. Your father made sure of that. The present tense of it, the permanence of it, the implication that Robert had seen what was coming and had acted. I watched David's face move through understanding and something else. A kind of reckoning. The look of a man who has been doing arithmetic in his head for months and has just been given the final number and it is not what he expected. The inheritance he had been counting on. The safety net he had assumed was there. The money that Fiona had been promising to their social circle would materialize when the time came. It was there. All of it was there. But it was mine. "We should talk," David said. His voice was careful now, the care of someone choosing words to manage a situation. Fiona didn't mean it wasn't supposed to. And here is the thing about a knockout line. The phrase comes when it is ready, when the setup has been sufficient, when the villain has been positioned at just the right angle for the blow to land properly. Fiona was not here, but everything she had done was present in this aisle, in this moment, in my son's careful, managing voice, suggesting that perhaps there were nuances I had failed to appreciate. "Your wife told me I was just the woman who used to live in your house," I said. My voice was level, calm, the way a stone wall is calm, not cold, not angry, just solid all the way through. "She said that to me at your father's funeral." "I think we're done talking, David." I walked past him to the checkout. My hands did not shake. I want to dwell on that, the not shaking. Because in the first moment after I had turned away from my own front door, standing in the rain with a bin bag, my hands had trembled uncontrollably, and that trembling had been a kind of loss, the physical evidence of a woman who was not certain she would hold together. The hands that paid for salmon and wine at a checkout in Tesco 8 months later were steady. They were the hands of a woman who knew what she had, who knew who she was, whose body had caught up with everything her mind had been working through and had arrived, finally, at something like ground. The legal consequences for Fiona came 3 months later. I want to be clear about my role in this. I had none. I did not report anything, investigate anything, orchestrate anything. I was simply living my life in Denistune, attending board meetings and book groups and Thursday evening dinners with Aisha, when Claire sent me a text with a link to the Glasgow Times website. The article was 3 paragraphs. Fiona Dalglish, 34, of Newlands, had been charged with theft and fraud in connection with her role at a church charity shop. An internal audit, prompted by discrepancies noticed by another volunteer, had revealed that over the course of nearly 2 years, items donated to the shop had been sold online privately, with the proceeds going into a personal account rather than the charities. Donation records had been falsified. The amount involved was over £8,000. The church had pressed charges. A court date was set for November. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the gray walls of my flat. The walls I had chosen. The color that was exactly right for a north-facing room in Glasgow. And I tried to identify what I was feeling. It was not what I expected. It was not triumph, not satisfaction, not the clean, bright feeling of a score settled. It was something quieter and more complex. The sensation of watching a long equation finally resolve, the last number fall into place after months of incomplete calculation. Fiona had taken things that were not hers. My home, my position in my community, my dignity, my mother's china, my son's christening gown, the 9 years I had given to that charity shop. She had also, for nearly 2 years, been taking things that were not hers from the charity shop itself, converting other people's generosity into her own gain with the same flat-faced efficiency she had brought to everything else. And now it was over. Not because I had done anything. I had done nothing, which is itself a kind of testimony, but because the things you take that are not yours tend eventually to make themselves known. The equation had balanced. I shared the link back to Claire with no comment. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the chair by the window that I had found at a charity shop in Parkhead and recovered in a wool fabric in dark green, the green I had wanted for the kitchen cabinets, which had then spread to one small upholstered chair and felt exactly right. And I thought about Robert. I thought about him sitting in this office a month before his death, with his notebook and his careful questions. I thought about 40 years of small deposits, accumulated with patience and discipline, and a faith in the future that I had not known I was the recipient of. I thought about him pressing that card into my hand in the hospital, the card I had put in my purse without asking why, and about how he had planned for the possibility that he would not be there to protect me, and had done it anyway, quietly, with love, the way he had done everything. You're just the woman who used to live in our house. I turned those words over one more time, for the last time, the way you turn a stone over in your hand before you set it down permanently. Fiona had meant them as a reclassification, a reduction, a stripping away of identity and belonging and history until what remained was nothing but the most minimal description. The woman who used to live. Past tense, diminished, erased, filed under someone who had been and was no longer. But here is what she had missed, what no one had seen, least of all me, until the rain forced me to learn it. I am the woman who rebuilt. The woman who stretched 127 hours across 11 days, who negotiated housing offices and charity shops and Travelodge front desks and came through all of it without breaking, who assembled IKEA bookshelves in 3 attempts and got them right, who sat across from a solicitor and heard incomprehensible news and asked the right questions, who painted walls pale gray and cut in cleanly around windows and chose furniture that reflected what she actually liked rather than what everyone else would accept, who wrote grant applications and trained volunteers and sat on a board of directors and brought shortbread to book groups and stood in a supermarket aisle with a basket of fresh salmon and decent wine and steady hands. She had tried to make me into the woman who used to live. Instead, she made me into the woman I actually am. Margaret's life now does not resemble her old one, and that is exactly right. She swims 3 mornings a week at the pool on Duke Street, and the exercise has given her body a different quality. Compact, energetic, the quality of a woman who moves through the world on her own terms. She wears brighter colors than she used to, a teal scarf that she would have called impractical a year ago, a good red jumper that she loves without apology. Her flat is smaller than the house she lost by about half, but every single thing in it is hers, chosen by her, placed exactly where she wants it. Tommy introduced her to his brother Frank in February, a widower, 61, who builds model boats in his garage and has opinions about Scottish history and makes very good coffee. They have been for coffee 3 times and a walk along the Clyde once, and nothing has been decided about anything except that both of them enjoy the other's company, which is, at 58, the right way to approach things. She does not hate David. That might be the most surprising thing, in retrospect. She does not hate him. She has, after months of turning it over, arrived at something more like a clear-eyed sorrow for what he chose and what he lost in choosing it. He is, she thinks, a man who made a fundamental error about what mattered and is now living inside the consequences of that error, and those consequences are his to navigate. She has her own life to be getting on with. Robert's letter. the one Morrison gave her, that she read that first night in the flat before the walls were painted, sitting on a camping chair borrowed from Tommy. She keeps in the top drawer of her bedside table. She does not read it often, but she knows it is there. And knowing it is there is itself a kind of comfort, the evidence, in his own handwriting, of everything he could not say while he was alive. He had written, near the end, "I know you're stronger than you think. I've always known." The bookshelf he helped her build in her head, assembled in 3 attempts in an empty flat, holds his Ian Rankin novels now. In an era when multi-generational families increasingly share finances, researchers have found that financial agreements made purely on trust, without documentation, without independent legal advice, without clear delineation of rights, represent one of the most common pathways to elder financial vulnerability. Studies in family law consistently show that assets transferred in good faith to adult children, without legal protections in place, are among the hardest losses to recover, practically or emotionally. What Margaret's story illuminates is not just the cruelty of one particular daughter-in-law in one particular city. It illuminates how easily we can be made invisible by the systems we trusted, and how the act of rebuilding that visibility is one of the most powerful things a person can do. The charity sector, where Margaret eventually found herself, not as a beneficiary but as a board director, serves in many ways as a net for people who fall through the gaps of what family and institution are supposed to provide. And the women who find themselves there, whether giving or receiving, are more often than not someone exactly like Margaret, not someone who needed saving, but someone who needed to be seen. Robert saw her. It just took losing everything for her to see herself. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it means everything to how many people get to hear Margaret's story. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and whether you saw the ending coming, because honestly, I need to know. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is your moment. Hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the video on your screen right now is about a family secret that was kept for 30 years, a piece of paper hidden inside a piece of furniture, and a reckoning that happened at the exact worst possible time for the people who deserved it most. Trust me, you do not want to find out about it from someone else. Watch it right now. I'll see you there.